is from Marilyn Halder, and her word is guided. That's a great word, Marilyn.
Love it.
Yeah, love it, love it, love it. So here we are. So probably like everybody in this room, I have a weather app on my phone. And I look at it, and I have different places around the world that I look at, and I just sort of track the weather. It's kind of one of those things that I do. But one of the things that's apparent everywhere, but it seems Temecula, where we live, is that autumn is in the air. And I say that because Temecula's just been bloody hot this last week. But despite, as Emma Curtis would say, despite the appearance of things, autumn is coming. You can kind of see it in how the light changes a little bit, and there's just like this little bit of coolness in the air, even in Temecula in the morning time. And there's other kinds of shifts that are they're subtle right now, but what we know is that great wheel is turning, and we're moving from the summer season to the autumn season, and everything that means and how that works. And I guess even in Temecula, one of the things that I've seen is the trees are starting to change. So there's this visual thing, but I think even more than a visual thing, there's an energetic thing that we begin to feel. And from a historic point of view, from a spiritual point of view, from a cultural point of view, autumn has an association with things falling away, the ending of things sort of dying off. The cycle of how things go, the summer, there's this great fullness of how things are, and then autumn starts to happen, and there's this time where things just kind of seem to be winding down or slowing down at one level, at the apparent level. And it's also, it's a time of endings. It's a time of ending so that other things can begin. I think it's very interesting that in a lot of cultures, particularly the Jewish calendar, begins its new year in the autumn, right around the equinox. So it's like, what is falling away to make room for what is wanting to come forward? And I would just invite you to consider that too, if there's at an energetic level that you're kind of feeling that maybe it's time to let something go. Maybe your body, maybe your soul, that energetic part of yourself has got this feeling that, yeah, it's time to let this thing pass. I'm not sure I know what's coming forward, but what I know is I need to kind of make room for what that is. There's also a sense of in the mythic world, in the magical world, autumn is a time for wandering. It's a time for adventures. It's a time to kind of set forth into something new. It's also considered the time where it's the passing between the two realms. We know later on, as autumn kind of ramps up, there's a lot of festivals about the veil between the two worlds and how they come very, very, very permeable. So it's the invitation then is just to kind of sit with, what does this feel like? What does it feel like to kind of feel this kind of transitions kind of coming? And then, of course, no secret, I'm a big Tolkien fan, and Lord of the Rings begins in the autumn. In fact, Frodo and Bilbo's birthday, for those that are reading the books, they happen in autumn, but it is the time, and I think what Tolkien is writing about there is what we see in that particular piece of literature is it is autumn because it is also that whole story is about the end of the third age. It's about the ending of an age for something else to kind of come into. And I guess what I'm talking about here more and more about is this concept of living in the imaginal world, the world of creativity, the world where all your words are portals into this place. And the imaginal world is a place that we enter into, we are drawn into, we are lured into, and it's an actual place. And for an example of that, think about a good book you have read, a piece of literature, or a mythology, or maybe even a sacred story. And if it is written well, if there's a craft in it, you feel yourself literally drawn into this world. And maybe it looks like, that in the story, someone goes up a hill, or someone rides a river, or someone goes out to sea, or whatever those kinds of things is. You can see those things, you can feel those things, you can experience those things. They will be different for each and every one of us, because those images come out of our subjective or unconscious mind. But if our hero goes up a hill, we all know what that looks like in our own eye of what that is. And part of this whole thing then is how we begin to discover or enter into this place. Because it's a practice, isn't it? It's a practice to cultivate the imagination. The imagination is the tool by which we enter into the imaginal. And the tool that we use is something called the active imagination. And Carl Jung talks about that. He says the active imagination is a meditation with images that arise from our subconscious mind. And so in our particular teaching, we talk about the imaginal world as a place where we create prototypes or mental equivalents. If we're wanting our life to be different in some way, we have to be able to imagine it first. If we can't imagine it, it's not going to enter into that creative process that we work with it. And so if we want to enter that portal, that imaginal world of what would it look like, what would it feel like, what would it experience like, it's a practice to get into there. You don't just sort of wish and hope, but there's something that happens. I've talked a lot about this guy by the name of Neville, who kind of bridges, this idea between quantum science and new thought, in the sense that when we create these mental images, when we have these imaginal experiences, that our subjective mind begins to sort of build a bridge to move towards the thing that we desire. So it's, the roots are in there. But I also want to offer that there's something really powerful about the imaginal world. We can easily say, yeah, it's all in our head, but as Don Loquette says, inside our head is a really, really, really big place. But it also connects, as Jung says, into these deeper things. And what I would offer is that the imaginal world isn't just something that we create, but it is something that lures us in. And that oftentimes what you hear about artists and scientists is that the revelation, the information comes from this place. An example is, you hear these stories of Emily Dickinson, and Emily Dickinson you'd see her like charging across the field and running into the room because she was afraid that if she didn't get to the desk on time, that the muse would pass her by and she would lose this poem that she was wanting to write. Or you hear about Mozart, right? And Mozart talks about how he would hear the music and then he would write the notes down. Or even Einstein. Einstein talks about, how he developed a lot of his theories on relativity, is that he would imagine himself riding a beam of light. And what would that look like? And of course, Tolkien, he's the king of this sort of thing as far as the working at the imaginal, and what he says is, I have ceased to invent. I wait till I see what really happened, or until it writes itself. What a powerful thing. I was reading something the other day about him, and there's an event that happens in the first book where the hobbits they experience a black rider. And what he says when he was writing that particular chapter is he thought the black rider was somebody different than who it was. And it wasn't until it unfolded itself to him that he began to realize that this story was taking on a whole new life on itself that he had not heretofore taken. And I wonder how many for each of us in this room have had that kind of experience, right? We think that we kind of know where things are going on, and then all of a sudden it reveals itself to us in a new way, and we go, whoa, I had no idea that's where this thing was taking me. Not so much what I was creating, but where it was taking me. So it's about living in harmony with forces and powers and principalities that are luring us and inviting us and drawing us in. And then how do we prepare for that? You know, are we exercising those intuitive muscles in order for us to kind of bridge into that? So I had this dream last night, and I figured out how to weave it into the talk, and apparently I am. So I had this dream last night, and it was a dream about the red heifer. Anybody know what's going on with the red heifer? Anybody know what red heifer with that? I know you do, Jim. Anybody else know? If you're an evangelical, you know exactly what this is all about. Because there's this wild apocalyptic mythology about a red heifer, and when a red heifer is in the land of Israel, the temple will be built in Jerusalem, and the temple will be reestablished to what it was, and there's this whole glory. It's pretty wild, it's pretty scary, honestly, because of what it implies, but it's this idea of how we create an imagination, or we inculcate an imagination about something. And so for many, many, many evangelicals, this is sort of a very apocalyptic vision of how close we are to an end time, and how precarious that can be, because if at a collective level we are imagining this sort of event and the implications of what it brings, then we can understand what's happening in that whole region, because what's happening in that whole region is really a mythology that is playing out, but it's a mythology that is being played out from a level of consciousness that is somewhat precarious. Rabbi Abraham Heschel, in the 1950s, wrote, he says, that the largest ecumenical movement in this country is nihilism. Let that sink in. The idea of what's the point? The idea of it's out of my control. The idea of, oh, who cares, whatever, you know, that sense of resignation, because that sense of resignation, that sense of nihilism, what it can give way to, and of course it has greater implications and much more powerful thoughts to think about. So how do we work with that? How do we work with that? I think we work with that by paying attention to what we're paying attention to. And one of the ways that we begin to do that is just paying attention to the words that we speak. Eugene Therakin says it this way. He says, language is not a communication tool, but rather a portal into being, an invisible reality summoned into our world by the very shape and sound of words. Properly speaking, words are incantations. Or as Heschel would say, words create worlds. So when I queried you guys at the very beginning, what words do you use to describe your being? What I'm really offering is a reflection on the incantations that you are using to create the being that you are in this world and where that goes for. And you know, he gets this idea from a group of intellectuals, of which C.S. Lewis and Owen Barfield and Charles Williams and Tolkien, they were all part of. It was a group called the Inklings. And one of the things that they said, he says, for them, words are not primary communication tools. They are not things we use to convey a message. Strictly speaking, the message doesn't come through the words. Rather, the words are the incarnation of the message, provided they are spirit-breathed. So in other words, become conscious of what you are saying, because what you are saying is powerful and it is creating something. Another person who I don't quote often understood this perfectly well, as most authoritarian figures do, and that's Mao Zedong. And what he wrote is this. He says, we will conquer the world because you, fools, think that words are labels. We know that words are little dynamite sticks in people's minds, and that we hold the fuse. That's how powerful words are. The words that we just sort of let slip in, and what triggers them, the words that we use, and also the words that we remove. Think of George Orwell and how, in his whole thing, words would be removed so that the meaning, the implication, the power of those words would sort of disappear. So then the invitation becomes then, how do we begin to work with this? I want to offer two images, because I think at the end of the day, it is our work to create images of hope. And it is our task to create a language to ourselves and to others of what hope looks like. So one thought was, I've been again, as you kind of look at the mythical world, how it's playing out, in like the Jewish calendar and liturgical calendars of a lot of spiritual centers, they see this time as a time of ending. And one of the things that is very apparent is from the biblical stories, the prophet Isaiah, and prophets were really interesting people because they not only spoke truth to power, they spoke words of hope. And Isaiah would create this image of a garden, and how one tends to a garden, and how sometimes in a garden we become angry at how things were or frustrated with how things are. But we know that in order for the garden to thrive, that we have to live a particular way, have to garden in a particular way, and have to tend to things in a particular way. And I think one of the things that what I've understood is one of the things that Isaiah spoke about as his image as a prophet is he was watching his nation go off the rails, that it had become weakened, because in the Hebrew Bible, in the Hebrew story, it's always a contest about, here we are being delivered from Pharaoh, but let's just create another Pharaoh. And here we are being liberated from bondage, but let's put other people in bondage. And here we are, trying to figure out how to live free, but let's figure out how we can enslave ourselves. And what Isaiah was always reminding people to was, return to the principles of what it means to live a just life. Return to the principles of what it means to live in connection to the earth and each other and to the divine presence, which is the source of all being. And the only way that he could envision saving his nation from defeat was that they would return back to the garden, as Crosby, Stills, and Nash would say, but they would return to a way of living. And I think that a lot because, as we watch the world that we're in right now, the only way, and it's not about rules and regulations, because that's the just opposite. When I think of something like the teachings of Jesus, he was much more interested in the humanity of an individual than he was about the fidelity to the law itself. So it's more about following our heart and living what it means to live justly, living what it means to live passionately, curiously, survivingly, whatever that word would be, achieving, striving, those kinds of things, to really allow those words to take root into our very being, and that we begin to incantate that word and let it incarnate to us so that we become the living, breathing expression of what those things would be. And I also think, that's also true in the stories of the early Christian church, particularly the book of Revelation or the book of the Apocalypse, which simply means a revealing of things. And I think that is probably one of the most misunderstood books in the entire Bible, whether it be the Christian Bible or the Hebrew Bible, because people think it's some sort of futuristic event. But the word apocalypto means to reveal, because what that book is about how things are. And if you were living in an occupied state, if you were living under an authoritarian rule, if you were living under a pharaoh or a Caesar, or call him whatever you would want to do, you knew that your life was in danger if you spoke to that power. And so it was written in kind of a very revolutionary, imaginary. Instead of calling out Rome, he uses Babylon. Instead of calling out Caesar, he calls out how it had become a prostitute. And he creates this thing because what he's wanting to do is reveal how things were then. And the reality is, how things were then is a temptation that we go over and over and over and over again. You know, Mark Twain says history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. And yes, you know, what does it look like to be at this time of the end of empire, or the idea of empire itself? And why do we think that we want to create that? But more importantly, why do you and me live in that, and what is our response to it? Is it a level of complicity or nihilism that we feel powerless? Or is it an invitation for you and I to take our personal power back? And by taking our personal power back, we sort of microdose the culture by living the presence of the truth itself, living that sense of that experience of who and what each and every one of us has been called into being. You know, I don't want to get too Tolkien-y, but I'll get a little Tolkien-y. But not just Tolkien. When I think in terms of so many interesting pieces of literature, and also about a spiritual community that I am part of, one of the things that we always talk about is look to the east. Look to the east. Because what happens in the east? The sun rises in the east. The day begins in the east. The opportunities for what is fresh and new and powerful come from the east. So instead of looking at what is passing, my invitation is that we look at what's wanting to emerge. Instead of just simply, and it's appropriate for us to grieve or to let go of what is going away, but the question is, what's wanting to come forth in our life? And each and every one of you have already called it forth into being this morning in this very room by answering it. It is the word that you have spoken. It is that incantation that is spoken into the active imagination, which creates a portal into the imaginal world where we can go and create and imagine ourselves and see ourselves and live with ourselves moving through. What does it mean to be adventurous? What does it mean to be grateful? What does it mean to be a survivor? What does it mean to be passionate? What does that look like? What does it feel like? What does it experience like? And the more that we get into that, the more real and powerful it becomes to us. It reveals itself more and more to what that is. And the more that that happens in us, we change the world. And so, yes, something is passing, but something is coming forward. And what is coming forward is speaking to you, and it's speaking to me, and it is revealing itself. And our job is to look to the east and take the next indicated step toward that lure. Thank you.